Hi, I'm Mike from Craft Supplies USA, and in today's video I'll show you how to turn a birdhouse ornament. My grandfather Dale was well known for his birdhouses, and every Christmas he'd turn a birdhouse for each of the grandchildren, and it made a great family tradition. With birdhouse ornaments there are a number of shapes and styles you can do, and you can see the ones here my grandpa's done. There's a ton of variety and a bunch of fun creative ways to turn an ornament. I'll show you a classic shape and it's one of my favorites. Let's get to the lathe and we can start turning. Alright, for the blanks we need for a birdhouse ornament, I have a couple pieces of 2.5 by 2.5 by 3 inch pieces of maple. You can use whatever you'd like. And then I have a couple pieces of holly for the finials and then the perch. So let's get these mounted up between centers, and we'll start by turning the top of the ornament. I've got my drive center just mounted in my chuck, and then I've got a revolving center here. And we'll be turning basically the same ornament. So we have 2 pieces of maple, the bottom half is dyed to give us some contrast, and then we have the holly, perch, and the finial here. So I'll set this up on the top. But first thing we need to do for the top is rough this down around, put a tenon on it so we can mount it in our chuck, and then we can start turning the top to shape. Make sure everything's locked down nice and snug, and then we can get our tool rest set up. Give that a quick spin to make sure you clear your tool rest. Right here I have a 1-inch skew. I'll be using this to rough it down. We can do some peel cuts. It'll loosen up a little bit as those drive centers press into the wood, so just snug it up. Make sure you wear proper eye protection and dust protection. And I'm going to rough this just down to round. I can still feel some flats on it. Okay, we're getting pretty close. We can bring our tool rest in. Now we can clean up the foot. We'll cut our tenon to fit our chuck. Give us just a small dovetail profile on the tenon. We can take that out. So we'll take our drive center out. We'll just set that up top for now. We can mount this back into our chuck. Clamp this down nice and tight. Both pinion gears, obviously. Alright, so we have our blank mounted in our chuck using a tenon. That'll give us a more secure hold since we're a ways from the chuck jaws and we need the extra support. And this is how the piece is laid out right now. So we'll taper this down to be our top of the finial. And what we need to do on the inside here is drill a 1-inch hole with a Forstner bit, and that'll allow us to mount it on a jamb chuck to finish turning the outside. And then we'll true up the underside of our finial here on the top. So right now this surface is pretty rough, so we'll use our skew to clean this up. This is a good slicing cut with the skew. It'll give us a clean surface. If we stop the lathe and take a look, we should have a pretty clean cut surface. There's just a little bit of tear out there in the center from when we did the peel cut. But now we can get our Forstner bit, so we'll take our revolving center out. I'll get my keyless drill chuck with the 1-inch Forstner bit mounted here, and I do want to do one more cleanup pass here on the end. There was just a little bit of tear out. Then I'll give ourselves a little dimple for our Forstner bit. Move my tool rest out of the way and we'll drop our speed down to around 500 RPM. And I like to get this centered up before I lock everything down, make sure everything's running pretty good. Then I'll tighten up the tool rest, or sorry, the tailstock. And I'll drill that about 1/4 inch to 5/16 deep, just enough to where we have support on our jamb chuck, but not too deep that we can't get the shape we need without cutting through where that 1 inch hole is. So a 1 inch hole, about 1/4 inch to 5/16 deep. And then once that's drilled out, we'll bump our speed back up. And I like to concave this just a little bit so that way where it meets the body of the birdhouse, you have a little bit tighter fit. I'll slide this out of the way. We'll sand this underside of the rim, and then we can turn our jamb chuck and mount the top of the birdhouse on it. I've got my 180 grit paper, and I'll drop my speed down for sanding. Alright, so we've sanded with the 180. We're going to go to that 240, and then we'll hit it with the 320. And we want to make sure we sand and get this underside of the rim here finished as much as possible, because we won't have any access to it later on once we flip it around. And then I'll get a little bit of scratch free here on a paper towel. And this will help refine the surface here. And then we do have a little bit of fiber left in that drilled hole, so I'll get my Forstner bit just to clean that out a little bit. Alright, let's stop the lathe and take a look. So we have a clean surface here, sanded and ready to go. We've got our hole drilled out about 5/16 deep, and that's a 1 inch hole. And now we can take this out of the chuck, and it's ready for mounting on our waste block. So we'll turn a small little tenon that'll press fit onto there. We can support it with our tailstock and then get this finial turned to shape. So we'll set these aside for a second. Grab my little scrap of waste block here, get my drive center back in. And we'll turn a tenon on this just to give us a little better hold as well. We can save this piece and use it for remounting later if you're going to turn a bunch of these birdhouses. We'll turn our lathe back on. We're at about 2,000 RPM. We'll do some peeling cuts here, so I've got the handle really low, and then we raise the handle. Tighten up my tailstock a little bit. And you can see how effective the skew is when you're doing spindle work like this, when you're doing planing and peel cuts. It's really quick and efficient. A lot of times I use the skew over a spindle roughing gouge. But use whatever tool you'd like. I've been trying to build up my skew skills after watching Matt Monaco's ability with the skew. Definitely got me intrigued in learning how to really use this tool correctly. So we've got this remounted in our tenon, so this is our waste block piece. We need to turn a 1/4 inch wide by 1 inch little tenon so we can remount this. Bring up our tool rest just a little bit closer. We'll do a peel cut to get our tenon. I like to chamfer it a little bit, and then what you can do is, because we have a little chamfer here now, we can test fit. And then you can see that burnished line, and that's the inside diameter of our drilled hole. And now we know what we need to turn our tenon's diameter down to. I think we're pretty close. Let's give that a test. Alright, it's just barely wanting to slip on, maybe another cut or two. There we go. We want this to be pretty nice and snug. That way you can turn the lathe on and this isn't going to fly off. If it's loose, you're not going to have enough of a working hold, so just part that tenon off and cut a new one. Now that it's mounted, we can bring up our tailstock, give us support while we turn away the bulk of the material here. And once we get down close to our final size, we'll remove that tailstock, round this over, and then we can sand and finish this piece. So this is the shape we're going for. So I think this blank is probably 1.25 inches too long. So I'll get my parting tool. We'll just part off a section of this, and then we'll bring our tailstock back in. Again, we're at about 2,000 RPM. You can go a little faster if you'd like. I'm just using the nano parting tool right now. Okay, I've got about 1/8 inch of a nub. I'll loosen up that tailstock and just saw that off. And this piece is long enough and it has a tenon on it, so we can reuse this as another jam chuck leader. So we'll set that off to the side. So now that we have our waist block piece cut off and we've got this to the appropriate length, we're about 2.5 inches here. I'll use my skew to clean up this torn fiber, and then we can bring our tailstock back in. Do a good little catch. Just true that up there. I'm using the long point of the skew here. I'm getting bevel contact first and then lifting the handle to engage the cut. If that point digs in, there's too much wood there in the way of the tip of the tool that prevents it from cutting. So just take a little bit of a lighter pass. And now for this really tight cove here, I'll switch to a spindle gouge. This is a 1/2 inch. I will have a small dimple there from the revolving center, so I want to account about 1/8 of an inch, 3/16 of damaged material that we'll be removing. And I'm looking for just a nice smooth curve that goes from here down, kind of bottoms out right about here, and then tapers back or up towards the top. My tool rest is just a touch high. Now we can bring it in as well. Got a nice half round here. Then we'll just match up these curves. Small little nub right there, just trying to clean that up. Give us a good surface for sanding. I'm pretty happy with that. Let's check it and see if we have any torn grain. See if we're cutting cleanly. Looks pretty good. I've got a little bit of a tear out there from a catch earlier, so we'll just reduce the diameter of the finial here just a little bit. Okay, do one more cut here just to clean up the surface just a little. Alright, I'm pretty happy with that curve. I think we're ready to sand. So I'm going to remove the tailstock. We'll cut off this waste block end. I'm just going to remove that, make it a little bit smaller. Give us a nice clean area for that line to break without tearing out the end grain. We can remove that tailstock, give us some space, and then I'll support the finial with my 2 fingers just to help prevent any vibration. Just kind of eat that down, peel that off a little bit. Get back in there with the tip of the spindle gouge, and that should give us a nice clean cut. We'll finish rounding off the end of the finial. Okay, I think that's a pretty good shape. Let's get our tool rest out of the way and we can sand the surface now. We'll drop our speed down to around 800. If you're sanding too fast, the paper doesn't abrade the surface very well, and it just kind of skims over the surface and doesn't actually cut it. So you want to drop that speed. I'll use my palm to sand the top of the finial. It'll help give us a nice curve. And I want to make sure I don't sand over this transition line here from this curve to that curve. I want that to be nice and crisp, so I'm not going to sand right on it. Alright, now we can jump up in our grit. Alright, and before we throw our scratch free on, we need to create just a small flat at the very top of this finial for our drill bit to seat up against when we drill a hole for our little eyelet screw. If I try to drill into that really tapered surface there, it's going to try and skate all over the place and probably tear up the surface. So we'll just create a nice little dimple or a flat, bump our speed back up again. Tool rest is just a touch high. So I've cut that nice and flat, and I'll use the tip of my skew here just to create a little dimple to help that drill bit find the center point. And we can take our revolving center out and we'll put our keyless chuck back in with a really small bit to drill it for the eyelet. Alright, so I've got my 1/16 inch bit. This, I'll be using the large eyelet screws, so depending on which size you pick, you might need a different bit. But we'll drop our speed down. And because we created that small little dimple in there to help that bit, we should be able to find center pretty well. And we'll drill this about just under 1/4 inch. That'll give us a little room for CA glue and the full length of the threads. So we've got a nice clean hole there. We can take this out. And now that we've sanded this up to 320, I'll get some scratch free, just refine the surface, and then the top will be done other than our final finish. And for this project, I like to use the spray lacquer. That's what my grandpa used. You get a really good high gloss finish, and you can spray it all once everything's assembled and glued together. So we'll bump our speed back up. And then just polish that surface. And this will give us a really good improved surface ready for a spray lacquer. Alright, pretty happy with that top. This one's got some good coloration in the maple. It was a little softer than what I'd like for an ornament kit like this. The harder woods, you can turn your finials quite a bit thinner without having them be risking of breaking or chipping or anything. So some of the exotic materials are a little better to use. Alright, so now we can remove the finial. We had a really snug working fit on there. A little harder to pull off than I would expected, but that's kind of what you need if you're not going to be using that tailstock for supporters. You want a nice tight fit. But our finial's ready to go. Before we glue it, we like to usually date it and sign whatever year the Christmas was and maybe who it was going to just on the underside of the rim here, and do that before this is glued together. We can set this piece off to the side, and now we're ready to turn the body of our birdhouse ornament. Alright, so we can take our waste block. We'll set this aside. If you're going to be doing a bunch of these ornaments, it's nice because you can just reuse this jig since we're drilling with a Forstner bit. But we'll get our drive center, we'll mount this back into our chuck. And we'll be using the body blank here. Mount this back between centers. Lock everything down, tighten up your quill, and we can get our tool rest back. Because we're using the skew for this roughing process, I'm going to raise that tool rest up just a little bit. Make sure everything's nice and snug, and then we can rough this down. Again, we're about 2200 RPM here. Tighten up our quill. We can bring our tool rest in a little bit. Using the long end of the skew as a planing cut gives us a good surface. Now we can mount this in our chuck, so we'll take the drive center out. Snug that down. Alright, so now that we have this piece mounted in our chuck, I'll get my keyless chuck here. I'll put this in the tailstock. And for the body of the birdhouse, I'll be drilling it out with an 11/16 bit. That's what we'll use to hollow out the inside. And if you want to open it up to lighten it a little more, you can use a scraper to just hollow it out a little bit. But we need to square up and clean this surface and then get this nice and round. We still have some flat spots here. So let's get this surface prepped for drilling. Just using the long point of the skew to give us a good planing cut. This 1-inch wide skew gives us a lot of cutting surface here, and that's going to be a bevel riding cut, and it'll give us a really clean surface. Okay, we're nice and square here. Now let's true up the end. We'll use the skew and give us a slicing cut with the long point down. I start with that handle nice and low, get that cut established, and we're riding the bevel of the tool. A little heavy on the bevel pressure there, you could hear that sound. Give us a small dimple for that Forstner bit. And again, this is a 11/16 inch bit. And these sizes don't have to be exact. We're just want enough room so that way when we turn the tenon to match into our lid here, when we hollow that out, we'll still have plenty of wall thickness for that little shoulder. But depending on the size of birdhouse you do, you might need to go up or down on the sizes of your Forstner bits. So we'll bump our speed down, about 500 RPM. And we're going to drill this body out about 1.25 inches to hollow out a lot of that material, make this birdhouse nice and light. And you can set your depth here with some tape, but I'm just going to eyeball it to about right here. Clear out those chips. And with this drilled hole, if you don't hollow it out, it's nice because then when we use our jamb chuck to fit on here, we have a lot of engagement surface on the inside here, and it'll give us plenty of support when we turn the outside of this. So now that we have that cut, I'm going to do just a couple more cleanup passes here with my skew. Give us a really good surface. Turn our speed back up. Okay, got a good surface there. And we need to do a peel cut here to give us a small shoulder that'll mount into the top of the lid. And this is a 1-inch hole, so we're going to make this tenon 1 inch, just a little over 1 inch to make sure we have a nice tight fit. And that shoulder width needs to be just shy of the depth that you drilled the lid, so make sure the length is appropriate for how deep you drilled that. We'll do that small chamfer, give us a burnish line. I'll take that out so I don't hit it. Okay, still just a little oversized. Small chamfer again, see if we can get that burnish line. It's just barely slipping over the front of that chamfer we've cut. It's a good catch. True up that surface. It's actually loose in the chuck. Create just a little more of a chamfer, see if we can get that burnish line. Okay, I can see my burnish line now. Now we can cut that tenon to fit. I think that tenon's going to be a little too long now because I had to remove some of the material because I had that catch. Let's test fit this piece. There we go, that's a good tight fit. I don't want to press that all the way on. I want to reduce the outside diameter of this about an 1/8 inch smaller than the diameter of our lid. That's going to give us a good aesthetic for when the two halves meet together. So I'm going to turn this down, make sure that's about an 1/8 inch smaller diameter than the lid is. So we have about a 1/4 inch of material to peel off. Let's check our diameter. Okay, it's right about the same size as the lid, so let's take off another 3/16. Okay, I think just a hair smaller is going to look a little better, but our tenon's a good fit. I think the length is a little, maybe a 1/16 too long, so we'll shorten that up as well. And then we can flip this piece around and mount it on our jamb chuck. There we go. I think that's the right diameter now, especially once we get a good cleanup pass on the end. So we can take this off. And you can see on the one I've finished, I have a slight little cove here. So we'll do our cove before we flip this around, and then we'll part this off. We'll get our spindle gouge and do that cove. It's a bevel riding cut. It's going to give us a really clean surface. Now when those two pieces meet, they've got a really good diameter. We got that nice cove that'll match into the lid. I'll double check my drill depth. Okay, so yeah, I think if we part this off here, that'll give us right about the good proportions to the lid to the body. So we'll part that off, and then we'll turn this piece that's in the chuck down into a little waste block we can use to remount the body to turn the rest of it. So. I'll just catch that as I part it off. We'll set this off to the side and we'll turn this down and use that as a jamb chuck to mount the body. And that peel cut makes quick work of the wood. Get that size down correctly. Create that small chamfer again. That'll give us our burnish line. And we can make this tenon quite a bit longer because we have that drilled hole that's about 1.25 inches deep. And the more wood we have supporting the piece, the steadier it'll be, and it'll give us a better turning experience as well. We can bring up our tool rest slightly closer. Just trying to darken up that burnish line so I can see it a little better. Okay, so it's just barely slipping on. A little more material to go. And this should be a pretty nice snug fit. Okay, now that we've got this mounted on here, we can turn the rest of the body shape to try and match what we've got here. And then we want that nice flat on the bottom for that finial to meet up to. So I'll square off the end. Just a touch high with my rest. Drop that down to where my cutting edge is on center. Use the tip of the skew to create a dimple for our drill bit. Okay, I'm pretty happy with that shape. We'll just square this up a little bit more. And I'm pretty happy with that shape, so now we can sand. But first, we'll drill the hole for our finial, and I'll be using a 3/16 bit. So we'll drop our speed down, and on these smaller bits, I like to use a brad point. It just helps it run a little more true. We'll drill that about 1/4 of an inch in there. That way we have plenty of room for our finial to give it some good support so it's not so prone to breaking off. But I'm pretty happy with that shape. I think that's going to match up to our lid pretty well. I think the aesthetics on that are about right on. So let's sand the piece. And for this lower half, I like to dye it just to give us some contrast for that holly to pop a little more. And then it'll make it look like a nicer piece of wood instead of just this kind of plain maple. So let's get our sandpaper. And we'll keep our speed low. I'm going to take that bit out so I don't gouge myself with it. It's like Matt Monaco says, we like to keep the blood in the veins. I'll roll this over to get into our little cove. And again, we don't want to sand the edges because we want those to be kind of a nice, sharp, crisp detail line. Now we'll step up our grit. Alright, and before we do our scratch free and our die for this bottom piece, I'm going to drill the holes for the perch and then the little hole for, the birdhouse entrance. And the larger hole, you can use a 1/4 inch or like a 13/64. And then for the perch diameter on the drill bit I'm using is a 3/16. So these are just approximate sizes. You can use whatever size you like, but I think that's a pretty good drill bit size for those. And with the brad points, I go about midway, and then I'll use the brad point to just give me that indentation where I'll start the drill bit. And then I like to do an offset perch. I think it looks pretty nice. It's the same way Dale used to do it. So I'll come over about 1/4 inch and then drop down about 1/2 inch, and that's going to give me the hole for the perch. And this is a little bit tricky to drill on the lathe. If you want to, you can put this on a drill press, and then that way you're going to be making sure your drill bit's running nice and straight. So I'll set that into that hole we pre-marked, and then I try and drill this as straight as possible. And then we'll get our smaller bit. This is the 3/16. And the reason I like to drill these now is that way I can sand where some of the bit tears out the surface just a little bit and make sure everything's smooth, as well as when we put our die on, it gets in those drilled holes. That way you have a nice uniform die pattern. So there we have our drilled holes. Now we can sand that surface again. Then we can throw our scratch free and our die on top. So I'll just get the 320 grit, sand this once more just to smooth out where the holes are drilled. Then we can grab our paper with some scratch free on here and just refine the surface. And we'll bump our speed back up to about 2,000. Get a clean piece of paper towel just to buff that grit into the surface to refine it. All right. That surface looks really good, no tear out, clean surface, no sanding, scratches or anything. Now it's ready for our die. So I'll grab our die, grab some gloves, and we can put that on. All right, so I have the artisan die. This is the chocolate. It's gonna give us a nice rich dark brown. Shake it up because the friction polish, or not the friction polish, the shellac in this die settles a little bit, so you want to make sure you shake that up nice and well, mix it up really well. We'll saturate our pad, and then we can just start rubbing this on. And because of the denatured alcohol base, this cuts through the scratch-free we had on there. That's a question we get a lot is, can I put finishes on top of scratch-free? If it has a solvent in it, yes. If it does not, no. So with this being an alcohol base, that'll strip off that surface of wax, allow that dye to penetrate. And then I just spin this by hand to give us a nice even coating of dye. And then what I'll do is I'll put a few drops in the drilled holes just to saturate those and make them nice and dark brown as well. Once I get a good even coat, I'll turn the lathe on, about 500 RPM, and then I'll just slowly buff this into the surface because it has shellac. So we want to basically friction polish that shellac, and that'll cure that over, as well as that alcohol will evaporate really fast. You want to make sure you get the shoulder over here as well. That way you don't have any undyed areas that you can see when the birdhouse is completed. I think that looks pretty sharp. We have some figure in the material. The dark natural brown looks really good, and it gives us a good contrast with our lid. If we just rough fit those now, I think that's a pretty good looking birdhouse. So now it's time to turn the finials and the perch, or sorry, the finial and the perch, and then glue our bird on, and then we'll do our spray lacquer finish, and then throw the eyelet in, and the birdhouse will be done. So let's just set this off to the side. I like to keep this up here on the headstock when I'm test fitting my finials, getting them, make sure that those have the right diameters. So I'll keep this up on the headstock. All right, so we'll take this chuck out. And we'll be swapping to the same chuck, but with the pin jaws, because we're going to be holding these really small pieces of holly. So these are just the pin jaws on a VM100. We'll mount up our piece of holly. I'll turn the perch first, and that should be plenty length there to give us the right sized perch for our birdhouse. Make sure that's nice and tight. All right, so we've got our piece of holly in here. Let's set up our tool rest. And the shape of the perch is going to be basically just a nice tapered piece with a little flare on the end. Using it as a taper allows you to not have to spend time trying to size it to fit exactly in the drilled hole. With it being a taper, it'll just fit in there and it'll be pretty nice. So let's use our skew, turn our speed back up. Switch to my spindle gouge to round this over if you need to. Support that with your finger. Give us a nice half dome here on the end. That looks pretty good. A piece this small starts to flex quite a bit, so you might need to support it with your finger or fingers. Just try and round that over just a hair more. And then we'll taper this down a little bit more as well. All right, now that we're pretty skinny, let's get our sandpaper. Drop our speed just a hair. Starting with the 180 grit paper. Okay, we'll go up to our 320. And this holly is a little tricky to work with, and because it's so white, it gets stained and discolored really easily. So you want to make sure you're using fairly clean paper that's not going to discolor it, or any colored paper. A lot of times sandpaper will have a certain color to the paper and it can stain the holly. And we're not going to be using any scratch free because just the grit in that is going to stain the wood. So we'll just sand it up to 320, and then when we assemble this, we'll just spray lacquer the whole thing, and that's going to make sure that the holly stays nice and white. So let's part off our finial, and we'll do a test fit and make sure everything fits nice. There we go, that's a good finial. So we have nice length on it. It press fit really well, so when we glue that in, it's going to be nice and secure, and then we can get that ready for spray lacquer. So now we need to turn the bottom finial after we've turned the perch. So we'll take this piece of scrap out, we'll throw in another small piece of holly we'll turn the finial out of. And I'll do kind of a droplet shape on the finial, basically the same shape as this. And I'll have the tenon that'll be going into the body on this end. That way we can get that sized and fit right and test it before we actually part this off. If I did it on the inverse side, there's no way to really test it other than using calipers and getting the exact measurement. But I like to do it on this side. So we'll use our skew, do our peel cuts to get this down to size. Just true up the end. And when you're sizing your tenons, you can keep that drill bit you use just to eyeball how close you are. I think we're about a 64th or maybe a 32nds away. And if you're doing a lot of these, it's really easy to make quick jigs to just test fit all the parts. My grandpa would use a crescent wrench and grind it down to use it basically as a parting tool that would fit the right size of tenon he needed. And we should be right about there. Let's test fit. just a hair too large. There we go, that's a nice snug fit. So now that we have our tenon sized, we can get the right shape we want for our finial. So I'll round this end over and then we'll taper that droplet style shape. We'll use the spindle gouge, that'll give us a really good clean cut on that little semicircular shape we have there. And then as you reduce the diameter, you might need to change the shape. And that's still quite a bit bigger than I'd like, so I'll turn that down some more. Supporting that with my finger. And the good thing about having the tenon on this end is you can test fit it with the mill, or not the mill. The good thing about having the tenon on this end is you can test fit the body to make sure the proportions of your finial match really well. I think that's just a little bit too big still, so I'll turn that down just a hair. But I like the shape we've got going, so. Okay, and before I get any further, I want to sand this while I still have enough material there to support it. And you got to be pretty light with the sandpaper because right now we only have a 1/16 of an inch of support and the holly is kind of soft. So it's not a very sturdy work surface. So you have to be very delicate and light. Stop the lathe and just double check the fit we have. I'm going to snap that off. I think we're good on our fit. Just going to part that material down, give me a little more workspace. To give this a nice taper, and then I'll just round that off and part it off. And there's our finial. So we've got that nice little tenon that'll mount in the body, and then I'm going to hand sand this end. This holly's so soft it hand sands pretty easy and it's such a small surface. Let's test fit that in our birdhouse. And there we go. So now everything fits well. We've got all of our parts and pieces. It's time to glue this together and then we can hit it with our final finish, which will be a spray lacquer. So I'll just set these parts off to the side for a moment. Alright, so we have our pieces laid out here on the table. We have our CA glue. Everything's ready to assemble. So we'll start with the perch. I've got the glue boost. This is the fill and finish. I've got the whip tip on there to get that glue right where I want it without getting excess glue on the body. So I'll coat the inside of that hole and then we'll press in our perch. And we'll do the same with the lid. And I like to coat the inside of the lid with the glue. I'll set that off to the side. I'll hit this with some activator. And then we can press these two together. And if you have a certain grain alignment, pay attention to that when you glue the lid and the body together. And make sure those are pressed and seated well. And then we can glue in our finial. Do the same thing here. Get that whip tip down inside the drilled hole. And then we'll press this in. And this one has a really nice tight fit on it already. So we'll set that there. Now that we have our parts and pieces glued together, it's time to go hit it with a spray lacquer. So I'll take this outside and do a couple coats of spray lacquer. Once that's cured, we can come back in and glue on our mini birds and put the eyelet in, and then our birdhouse will be complete. So the process for the spray lacquer is pretty simple. If you're doing a bunch of these, it's nice to keep the parts disassembled, and you can make some stands to just spray lacquer a whole bunch at a time. But if you're just doing a one-off, I like to assemble it completely. And I'll shake the spray lacquer up. This is the Master's Magic Gloss. This gives me a really good final result. But I hold it about 8 to 10 inches away from the piece, and I'll usually spray lacquer the bottom half first, wait for it to dry, and then I can hold that finial and then do the top half. So I'll just show you a quick little way of doing this while we're in the studio, and then I'll go outside to finish spraying. But whenever you're using this stuff, make sure you wear a respirator because this stuff's pretty nasty. But 8 to 10 inches away, make sure the can is shaken up really well, and then just nice light coats across the surface, and basically do that across the entire thing, and then you're going to be done. Let it cure for, a few hours, and then you can go ahead and put your eyelet screw in and glue the bird on. So I'll take this outside and finish spraying it, and then we'll come back in and see how it looks. Alright, so we've let our spray lacquer finish cure, and I've glued in the eyelet right here. And now it's time to glue on the bird. So what I'll do is I'll hit the finial with just a little bit of activator. And then I'm going to put the CA glue on the underside of the bird. Use that whip tip, just get a nice little layer of CA. And now we can set our bird on top of our perch. And then give it just a little extra activator. And there's our birdhouse. So there's a complete finished birdhouse. It's a really fun project. My grandpa was known for these. Really fun, and you used very minimal material, and you can make really cool looking birdhouses. You've seen some of the ones we had earlier. Tons of different variety, different options. But get to the lathe, try doing a birdhouse this year, see if your family likes it. And if you liked the video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more wood turning videos.